Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I'm Laura Sanchez. I'm the director of the Intercultural Center. And to begin, I would like to acknowledge that across this state, nation, and continent, we're on the homelands of Native and Indigenous people. In Washington State, there are 45 tribes, and the physical location of Whitman College is on the traditional Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla homelands. To pay proper respect, we must acknowledge the true history of the land we are on, the experience of the people who have inhabited this land, and how that history affects the present and future lives of Native and Indigenous people. With acknowledgement comes the ability to express authentic gratitude and to honor the Native and Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. I'd like to now take a moment to thank IPEC as co-organizers of this event, and I'd also like to thank the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Race, Violence, and Health academic theme for their support. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Chloe?
Hi, so I'm Chloe Hood and I'm the social media manager for IPEC. And I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Rosalie Fish is a 19-year-old Indigenous runner from the Cowlitz Tribe. Rosalie grew up on the Muckleshoot Reservation and in May of 2019 dedicated her state track meet to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Since then, Rosalie has continued her career as a student athlete and Indigenous persons advocate at Iowa Central Community College. So Rosalie, we're so glad that you could be here. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
So Wiat Eskechet, Rosalie Fish Sitsta, Muckleshoot Tribal. Hello, my name is Rosalie Fish. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for giving me this platform to be able to share a bit, not only about my story and not only about missing and murdered Indigenous women, but what it means to be an advocate for a cause such as missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I'd like to start off by just sharing a little bit of information about this issue, just because a lot of Indigenous issues are misrepresented, or a lot of information regarding Indigenous women is often left out of mainstream media. So 4 in 5 Indigenous women will experience some type of violence within their lifetimes, whether that be psychological or physical or sexual. Another instance is that Indigenous women, especially on some counties, will experience murder rates up to 10 times the national average. And so in May of 2019, myself as a high school athlete dedicated my 4 races to missing and murdered Indigenous women, and to 4 Indigenous women in particular who either went missing or were murdered in my reservation. And so I am currently working on pulling up some photos so that this is a little bit clear. So it's very essential to me to share the names and the faces and the stories of the women in particular that I ran for. And so if I can figure out how to get my presentation up. And I'll just share the screen here. Okay. Is that showing up okay? Okay. So down here, I have some photos of the women that I ran for back at 2019 of my state meet. So for my 400 meter race, I ran for Misty Upham. She went missing and was found about 11 weeks later after police did not look for her and mislabeled her death as a suicide. And this was on the Muckleshoot Reservation. For my 3,200 meter, I dedicated my race to Renee Davis and her unborn son, Masi Molina, whom she was 6 months pregnant with at the time Renee Davis was shot and killed during a welfare check by King County Police. Jackie Salyers was also killed by police in Tacoma, Washington, and she was also pregnant at the time of her death. And Alice Looney, my aunt, I dedicated my 1600-meter race for, and she went missing in Wapato in 2004 and was found 15 months later, deceased with no type of evidence towards what happened and no answers from police. So Washington, and particularly Seattle, but so Seattle, as far as the city itself, is one of the highest cities with missing and murdered Indigenous women cases, and Washington is the second highest state in the entire nation, with the highest amount of cases. And so with this, I wanted to talk a little bit about how this affects youth as well. So on some reservations, like the Pascua Yaqui Reservation, 43% of households account for single mothers. And so these are mothers, sisters, and aunts going missing from reservations, and this very much disproportionately impacts Native youth who are now having their caretaking and even like leadership roles from their families taken away. And so as you can see here, it says that Native children account for a specifically high rate in foster care, even though they are not being, I guess, equally represented in the foster care system. And this epidemic contributes to that. And I want to talk a little bit about my story as well. I faced a lot of bullying and racism in elementary school, as well as sexual harassment because I am Indigenous and because of being one of the few Indigenous peoples in my public school setting. And in 2016 or February of 2016, I attempted to take my own life due to the sexual harassment that I faced as an Indigenous woman in my settings, and particularly both the intersection of racism and sexism that I faced in my school. And then with this slide, I like to quote Billy Mills, who was an Olympic gold medalist, and he always said that your life is a gift from the Creator, and what you do with your life is your gift back. And through running, I found a way to empower myself not only as a woman, but as a Native American. As I attended Muckleshoot Tribal High School, and there I faced a lot of discrimination from other schools who were not tribal schools. But through my running, I was able to compete in my races with pride, and also wear my Muckleshoot Tribal uniform with pride. So in my area, which is the Washington area, or Washington, even Auburn area, the Pacific Northwest in general, does have a lot of issues as far as discrimination and prejudice towards Native American people. So when it comes to running for missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular, I like to accredit Jordan Marie Daniel. Jordan Marie Daniel is a Lakota runner who ran the Boston Marathon in 2019 with the original handprint before I did. And it was her work and her dedication that spread out, and it reached me all the way over here in the Northwest. And it made me realize that I need to do something with the platform that I was given. And so I reached out to Jordan, and since then she's treated me as a mentor. And she gave me permission to run with the red handprint right after her. And so that was just a little bit of recap about to how I got here. And since then, I'm doing everything within each opportunity that I have to continue to raise awareness towards missing and murdered Indigenous women, because not only does it impact my family, but it actually has impacted my personal story as well. And now I think, is it the time for the open Q&A?
Yes, thank you, Rosalie, for sharing your background and the inspiration of your work. I do want to mention to those who are viewing right now that there is a Q&A box, And in that box, feel free at any time to type in some of your questions, and I'll be moderating that. And at this point, we'll have Erica and Shyson begin the Q&A, so they have some prepared questions. And again, though, feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box. So Erica and Shyson. Go ahead and please introduce yourself, and you can get started on the Q&A.
Mai kako o Shaisen konala ko uinoa. Welcome everyone. Hello everyone. I apologize. There was some background music, or not background music, but background noise that was a bit very disruptive. My name is Shaisen Kubirao Sipe. I am the co-president for IPEC, and I am a current sophomore. And I'll pass it on to Erica.
Hi, my name is Erica Tadama. I am the other co-president of IPEC. I'm coming from the San Alfonso Pueblo down in northern New Mexico. I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm really glad that you all were here, to be able to be here today as well, and especially at Rosalie. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Shyson for the first question.
Thank you again. Alrighty. Thank you for this event. Why do you think Seattle and Washington State have those numbers compared with other places in the US that have large Indigenous populations?
So I think it is super important to note the high population of the diverse tribes within the Washington state. So there's a lot of different tribes, not including like the Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Yakima, etc. And so I think that is part of it, but I also do think that along with I would say the policies that go along in, the policies here do not really acknowledge Indigenous peoples within Washington state. And I firsthand have experienced a lot of racism within the reservations from non-native law enforcement. And I think a really key example would be with Misty Upham's case. Misty Upham and actually both Renee Davis, who were missing or murdered Indigenous women within Washington state, both experienced multiple forms of police brutality before the time of their death. Jacqueline Salyers as well. And so I think it is very essential to acknowledge the bias and the prejudice that can come with law enforcement and what actually happens when women are reporting missing. With Misty Upham, she was missing for 11 weeks, and that was when she was found by her own relatives who did search parties. Law enforcement did not look for Misty Upham, and they had actually told her family that they should check to see if she's on a bender first before they look, because they didn't want to waste their time. And so it's this type of prejudice that goes unchecked, and that is really costing lives.
Right. Thank you so much for that answer. The next question that we have is, what prompted you to choose the women that you ran for way back in high school in your first run?
Thank you. So all of those women, including, of course, one, Alice Looney, was my aunt. And so her disappearance and her death heavily impacted me. But also all of those women, their deaths very much stuck with me as I was growing up. They happened from 2004 up to 2016. And so that was a time period in my life which I was growing and beginning to understand my place in the world. And what I was underhandedly told while continuously growing up in, I guess, in an environment that didn't seem to value Indigenous lives, I felt worthless, especially to see that my role models at very young ages um, being exploited and to be even more so just kind of tossed aside. And so that's kind of how I chose the women that I ran for. It was very much, I didn't really choose them, but they were already with me. And I decided that I was finally going to show them to the world. And I wish I had done it sooner.
We have another question. Rosalie, there seems to be a lot more, this is coming from Kazi Joshua. Rosalie, there seems to be a lot more coordinated national action in Canada as opposed to the States on this issue of missing Indigenous women. Do you have a sense of why this difference exists? Indeed, it may be argued that why this moment in Canada has been around for some time.
So I do believe that I know exactly what you're talking about. As far as Canada goes, they have actually declared genocide along with the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that is something that I think has been happening for a very long time. But I also think that missing and murdered Indigenous women as an issue was recognized in Canada, um, in their nation, much faster than it was recognized here in the United States. For as far as missing and murdered Indigenous women, it did not reach mainstream media until about 2019. Um, Meanwhile, not to say that people haven't been doing this work, but the United States simply did not acknowledge that this was an issue, and still is actually in the process of acknowledging that missing and murdered Indigenous women is an issue, as opposed to Canada, who they have, as a nation, I would say, been acknowledging that this is happening for a longer period of time than the United States has.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, have you continued to raise for specific missing or murdered Indigenous women while in college?
Yes, I have. So back in my first race as a college athlete that was for missing and murdered Indigenous women was also in 2019 in my cross country national championships for the NJCAA. And I dedicated my race to missing and murdered Indigenous women. This one was not a particular woman, but it was to bring awareness to the state of New Mexico. I made like a little poster board, and I showed like the different cases, and I wrote out that New Mexico was the highest state for missing and murdered Indigenous women cases, and so that's kind of what I ran for because the national championships was in New Mexico. And so I didn't dedicate it to a particular woman that time, but I instead kind of made like this little educational board and tried to make it relatable to where I was running. And then the next time that I ran for Indigenous women was actually, I think, last Tuesday. I had the half marathon national championships in Fort Dodge, Iowa. And with that, I dedicated it, all of my 13 miles to 13 women who've gone missing or been murdered. In that case, I actually just went by request. Um, and so there were a few repeats, like I ran for all 4 of the women that I did, as well with 5 others, or not 5. Um, and then with that 5th person was Masi Molina, who was the unborn baby, which based on the request of the family, I decided to add. And then the other 7 people were all by request as well, and many from the Northwest Washington state. I could actually say them. I would like to now that. So I'll just get the names here. Obviously, Alice Looney, Renee Davis, Masi Molina, Rosenda Strong, Jacqueline Salyers, Misty Upham, Stonechild Chiefstick, Jalachia Finclia, Alberta Stahi, Kay Hudson, Tika Lewis, Jessie Saray, and Courtney Holden. And so those were the 13 people that I raced for last Tuesday for my half marathon national championships.
Thank you for that. Do you know of other young women who have taken up the pursuit of running to bring attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Yes, I actually do know a few. Many athletes in general, not only women, but Native men and also like Native basketball players, football players, lacrosse players. So the other woman, of course, the first one who comes to mind is Jordan Marie Daniel, because she's actually the person who ran with the handprint before I did. And she still does to this day. She was also my inspiration as to how I dedicated my 13 miles, because in track I dedicated each of my races, but she's a marathoner and she dedicates each of her miles. And so when I ran a half marathon, I asked her like, "Hey, is it okay if I do this?" And she told me, "Yes, I think it's the way I do it." And so I think that's the way to go about it. And so she also sent me a little tobacco pouch that I ran with like in my strap. And so and then when I got done running with it, and then I'd say each name at the mile mark, and then I burned the tobacco pouch when I got done, just as like as a form of prayer as well. And so Jordan Marie Daniel has really just been my mentor throughout this whole process, and she helps me keep myself accountable in how I'm representing our relatives and how I can be contributing more to our conversations.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. Um, our next question is, what do you think about athletes and activism these days? Do you think high-profile athletes could be doing more to bring awareness to important issues of our time?
So athletes and activism, I am all for it, clearly. I am a part of a group called Athletes for Impact, and that is where it's a group or an organization of athletes that all come together from various levels, whether it be high school all the way up to pro. Um, and that's where I think it's very important for athletes to acknowledge the platforms that we have, and the power in our voices and how many people we are able to reach. I think it is especially important to acknowledge that and to use that to make a difference, because when it comes down to it, we might be athletes and we might be on screens or whatever it may be. We may be being watched or used for entertainment, but at the end of the day, and we might have this uniform on, even though I might say run for Iowa Central, I am Rosalie Fish, and nothing can take that away from me, even though my status as an athlete, or whether it be I'm running with a specific uniform on or at a specific place, I'm still running as Rosalie Fish. And to me, I will not forget what has happened to me, and I will not forget the consistent and the constant threat that comes to myself and to my family as Indigenous people. I will not do that for a sport or for entertainment or for peace of mind of the people watching me. And so I think it's very important to connect athletes and activism, because we are people, and it's just as important to us too.
Oh, that's great. How do you think the national discussion around police brutality can make space for addressing the violence committed against MMIW? Do you think that this could happen in partnership with movements such as Black Lives Matter?
I'm really happy. Thank you so much. This is Kelsey asked this question. Thank you so much for asking this question. So I think the national discussion around police brutality has been making a lot of progress towards missing and murdered Indigenous women as well. And that is because Indigenous peoples are also extremely vulnerable to police violence and are targeted from police violence. And I think I've actually spoken at a few Black Lives Matter protests in order to represent Renee Davis, because she was a Black and Indigenous woman killed by police during a welfare check. And I think it is super essential to be allies in the Black Lives Matter movement, because this is really our fight as well. I think it's an Indigenous persons issue that when Black Lives Matter and missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous rights in general come together for a common goal, which is justice and equity for people of color. I think that, and actually I've seen it before in Seattle. I think we get pretty unstoppable. So I do think police reform, which is what Black Lives Matter is striving for, will very much and heavily, I guess, influence missing and murdered Indigenous women in a positive way, and also bring light to the injustices that happen in the police force, because they are definitely there, especially within Washington.
Got to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Rosalie. What is the significance meaning of the handprint?
So the handprint represents the silencing that has happened to the women who have been victims of violence. And so a lot of the women, specifically Indigenous women, who experience this type of violence, whether it be going missing or being murdered, very much have their voices stolen from them, and their experiences are not counted or are considered not valid as far as when it comes to making legislative changes. And so that handprint is to represent the silencing that is happening to Indigenous women through this violence. And so, yeah.
Outside of sports, are there any other platforms that you or others have found to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women? Sylvie Corwin.
Definitely. I actually think literally anything can be a platform, whether it be, like this right here with a panel discussion, or I was invited to give a TED Talk in Seattle, and that was definitely a platform. And so there's public speaking, there's athleticism, there's people using their art, right, and actually painting like the handprints on people's and making portraitures. There's even there's dancers, there's playwriters. Anything can be a platform, whatever it is that you may specialize in, or something that just empowers you, something that you love doing. There's almost always a way to gear that towards an issue that you care about. And so I've seen it on almost any platform I can imagine, actually. Playwriting was the one that I didn't think of. And I was invited to a play about Misty Upham and what happened to her.
Thank you so much. Can you say what it is about running specifically that makes it a powerful form of activism? Are there other forms of activism in which you also engage or would suggest for other young people?
I chose running. For me, it's powerful because it was something that empowered me already. Running was something that I could use to demand acknowledgement, not only just for myself, but for whatever it was that I was representing. And for me, I ran at Muckleshoot Tribal High School, and when I would show up to a meet that was very big or popular, and somebody had never seen or even heard of the Muckleshoot tribe before, if I won that race or I placed highly in that race, I could demand that they know Muckleshoot Tribal School. And to me, that was something that was very empowering, because beforehand I felt invisible. And I also think for me, running, traditionally, as an Indigenous person, runners are the messengers, or I guess traditionally speaking, runners were seen as messengers. And so I take it very literally and figuratively, I guess. And that's why running is powerful to me. Public speaking is also a form of activism, and I would say even storytelling is a form of activism that I like to use. And similarly, storytelling is also a traditional and very valuable thing within my Indigenous community, because it was a way to keep things alive. And so I think to find the forms of activism you can engage in, it's really the things that you are already doing, or the things that you do that make you feel powerful, or the things that that keep you connected to something important.
Stan Thane asks, could you speak to the imagery of the red handprint and your experience with this visual image?
Yes, thank you for asking that. So with the red handprint in particular, I think I already went into about how it represents the silencing, but I've actually had quite a few experiences where it was mistaken for war paint. Even though my tribe and in particular doesn't use war paint, we use paint only as a means of prayer and protection. And so I think that really goes to show for the types of stereotypes that go along with, like, let's say, Native mascots and these kind of characters that are designed to represent Indigenous peoples that are not accurate. And so I've had a lot of people, shout nice war paint at me while I was running. And I'm very excited to share that last Tuesday I was running a half marathon, and somebody said, I like your war paint. And then I actually had the energy to go back and say, it's not war paint, and actually got to respond because it was a little bit of a longer race. So I was going a little bit slower so I could actually get a word out. And so that's something that at first it really, really got to me. And something that kind of hurt me quite a bit was to see my paint misrepresented. It hurt me at first, but I've slowly been able to kind of get the word out. Like, no, it's not war paint. We don't. My tribe doesn't do that. We pray.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. What has your experience been with regard to support from your coaches and teammates?
So I've experienced different levels of support from different coaches and different teammates for sure. With my first coach, my high school coach, he coached at a tribal school, so he knew what he was signing up for. And especially he knew with me, I was already kind of a handful already to begin with. So adding the paint, he didn't really, wasn't surprised by that. And he was very much supportive. In fact, he fought, whenever I have a coach, they kind of have to fight for my right to run with paint, because there are going to be people who are made uncomfortable by it, or are maybe even a little bit scared of the idea of politics, quote unquote, coming into athleticism. And so he fought for my right to run with the paint, and made sure that if anybody came to try and get me disqualified from my races, that he would have the piece of paper that shows that it was legal for me right there, ready to go. And on my last race, the 400 meter for the last race, I was running the 400, and it was a very painful race. I was very, very emotionally and physically tired, but he came up to me and told me, you're not only running, for these women, but you're running for my daughters, because my daughters are Native, and you're running for your little sister. And he said, I know. He said, I know you can do this because you're not just doing it for yourself. And so that was, he's my coach, and he's my mentor still to this day. And I'm very grateful for him. There are some athletes in my college now who are not Native and are very uncomfortable because I'm talking about something uncomfortable. But to me, being uncomfortable is the very minimal price to pay for any type of real change. So I don't mind.
That's awesome. Gabe Bossman says, in what way have you found support or rejection from the running community? In what ways can other runners help create a community that engages in activism?
Thank you. So I have found an overwhelming amount of support from the running community, which I wasn't actually sure if I was going to get. I think there was a lot of the running community who, in reality, if they had known that this was happening, they would have already dedicated themselves to doing more. So I have had the honor of being able to educate a lot of allies that I have now on this issue and how to go about it appropriately and to spread awareness appropriately. And I've really been grateful because the running community is, I think, is pretty known for its kindness. And I've faced very little amounts of backlash or rejection. And when I do, it's, I would say that it's done in a very passive aggressive way. Like somebody will say, "Oh, you have something on my face," and I can just say, "Thank you, I know," and then it's over. But for the most part, the majority has been completely supportive. And I think runners can help each other and their community engage in activism. And based off my experience, it's just doing so and then sharing about it. So I don't want to push anybody into activism, but when you show somebody, I can do this, it lets them know that if you're similar, right? Like I'm a runner, I can run for other people. That kind of subconsciously tells any other runners that they can as well. And so by leading by example, it's very, I think it's a lot easier to reach the people who want to do this work because when they see you, it will connect with them.
I just want to take a moment to say that Jordan Marie Daniel is on the latest Trail Runner magazine, and there's an amazing story. So thank you for sharing more about her. And there have been amazing questions, and please keep them going. But there's one question I wanted to make sure I got in here. And I was hoping that you can talk about how you maintain mental wellness in your activist work.
Thank you. Yeah, this is something that I continuously have to work on every day. I know a lot of activists, this is usually the one question they don't have an answer for because it is very common in activism to kind of wear yourself out and to have secondhand trauma and these types of things. And so for me, I think one thing is when I take care of myself physically, and I don't just mean like eating clean or, anything like that, but I mean just actually taking and cutting out a chunk of 3 hours in my day to physically rest my body, um, or to do something like go and even though I feel bad, ask that one teammate for a massage or something, and really just kind of, I wouldn't say treat myself, but indulge myself, maybe in the things that totally convince myself that I don't have time for, because you are definitely worth the time. And I know it gets, especially when it comes to activism, it's not about you. It's about the people that you're representing, or the people that really need the attention. But we also need attention too, or you might even be part of the demographic that you are representing. So I would think for me, it's actually just a moment to recognize my value, because sometimes it's easy to view advocates as they're just a boat with a message, but sometimes you need to refuel that boat because otherwise it'll sink. And I have yet to sink, but I've come close a few times when I just completely ignored all my needs and I kept doing doing things consistently without breaks, without checking in on my own mental health, or without even like scheduling just like a 1 week thing with a therapist. It's actually essential to acknowledge your own psychological and physical needs.
Thank you so much, Rosalie, for that. From Kazi, he asked, "You are a college student. How does this work intersect with your studies?"
Thank you for asking that. As a college student, I'm pretty good at making all of my professors feel uncomfortable, or especially as an Indigenous college student, whether it be telling my diversity professor that he spelled Navajo wrong, or really just saying like, "Wow, I really would appreciate if the diversity class had a land acknowledgement." Just being that that pesky voice in the ear that I exist, don't forget, I exist, these issues exist. And with missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular, I use every single assignment opportunity to speak about Indigenous issues or missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I'm in a social problems class today, and he says, would anybody like to share, what they're working on? And I said, I would love to share what I am working on with the class. And really just taking every single opportunity, whether it be an opportunity to educate another student, an opportunity to educate your professor, because as Indigenous students, we have a lot of knowledge that the professors may not be aware of, or hopefully educate your entire class, or maybe even a little bit bigger than that. And that's making a difference. And that also helps me get better at what I do outside of school too.
Thank you for that. We have both a question and a praise. Praise from Scott Shields. I am thankful that you took the time to speak with us today. Your strength and maturity are amazing. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you have done and continue to do. Yay, Scott. And then the question is, you've talked about how raising awareness is key. What, in your opinion, are some other examples of important steps that need to be taken going forward to address the issues of MMIW?
Thank you. So yeah, after we actually acknowledge that this is an issue and there needs to be steps taken, so the Violence Against Women Act of 2019, or sorry, the Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act of 2019 is a super important piece of legislation that would actually help create a safety net for women in general, and especially women of color that are extra, I guess I'd say women who are either vulnerable or targeted for exploitation and any types of violence. And so there's like a few pieces of legislation out there that definitely need to be reauthorized or even maybe voted in. And then along with that, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to happen as well with and outside of tribes. And so within tribes, there are some tribes who have the resources to be able to create task forces and other kinds of things like support groups that I think would definitely create an environment where it was a lot harder for certain women to kind of slip through the cracks. And that, as well as I think when it comes to non-native people coming on the reservation, I guess the best way to describe it is finding a way to stop non-native peoples from targeting Indigenous women. There are a lot of non-native perpetrators and sex traffickers who purposefully come to the reservation where women might be vulnerable, and they target these women because of that. And so the fight against sex trafficking is also a fight against missing and murdered Indigenous women. And with that, and one more thing is also the relationship between the federal government and tribal sovereignty. If there is a non-native person who commits a crime on Indigenous lands, that is up to the federal government to charge that person, and the tribe has no type of power to prosecute that non-native person, even if they committed the crime to a native person on tribal lands. And so that is something that has been a huge barrier as far as creating accountability in these types of cases.
Thank you so much for that, Rosalie. Another question is, thank you for your example, or another praise is, thank you for your example and your education. On the theme of self-care, did running help you through your own dark time in the past?
Yes. In fact, before I started running for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and back in 2016, when I had, as a freshman in high school, I attempted to commit suicide. And then after that, I transferred to Muckleshoot Tribal School because they knew that within my own community that I would not be targeted by non-native abusers anymore. And I took up track at the school, and it absolutely helped me through. I would say, like, while I had recovered from my suicide attempt, I wasn't completely healthy. I definitely still was dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety. And so, um, and I had, I guess I would say a counselor who attempted to put me on antidepressants, and they weren't really working out very well for me. And I wasn't sure what else I could do. But with running, it actually was a safe space for me there at my school, and it channeled the way that I felt about everything that had happened to me and the way that I felt about my place in the world. It channeled it into something where I could work and I could see myself get better. So not only did that help, maybe release a few of these negative feelings, but it also helped create a lot of a sense of self-improvement and self-value when I was able to put time and effort into something and then to see it grow and to get better. And that slowly evolved from self-empowerment to my school and my tribe's empowerment, and then pretty much is kept going further up to Indigenous women in general.
Thank you for that. Kazi, jokes. Have Erica Kay and Coach Shield talk to you about considering transferring to Whitman after your AA at Iowa Community College? Wink.
I will say I have definitely, I'm really thinking about coming back to Washington after transferring, only because they tell you to get out and see the world. And so I did. And I realized I got lucky when I was born in Washington. I like the trees. I don't like the corn, as I've learned. And I will be coming back, but I don't want to say anything yet because I have to wait. But I'm gonna be back in Washington.
And with that, we have time for one more question. If Erica or Shaisen or Chloe, if you have a question to finish this session, feel free to ask at this time.
Laura, I also invite you to ask a question if you have one.
Well, I do. Just one more. So thank you. And I briefly wanted you to mention, and you have it here and there, but some of the other issues that are important to you and that you want to bring to light or voice. If you can share some of that at this time, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I'll try to make this as quick as possible, but I'm not gonna lie. I believe in the power of multitasking, and so pretty much any issue that somebody brings up to me, I'm like, that matters too. So I'll try to go through these quickly. One of the ones that I've really been involved with lately is the Black Lives Matter movement, mainly because it's something that also impacts Indigenous peoples, but also because I do have my stepmother is from Ghana, and both my stepmom and my two siblings are both in the Black Americans, and so that's something that even if I didn't have these relatives, it would still be important to me. But something that just makes it hit a little bit closer to home, especially since my 5-year-old brother is very vulnerable in the future to police brutality. And so that's something that I've been really pushing forward for as much as I can. But one right after that is suicide prevention and awareness, especially among youth. Also something that I can have a little bit of personal perspective on. It's something that I think is misunderstood, especially when it comes to the lack of trauma-informed care that comes with youth, and something that is very much needed. And so that's another one. And then obviously a third one would be environmental activism. Um, not only because I like living, but also because it's something that's very important to the Indigenous culture in general. The Mother Earth is something that is sacred in my practices. It's something that Mother Earth is something that heals me consistently, and my rituals and my self-care practices and my prayer practices are all very heavily reliant and are humbled to Mother Earth itself, and as well as like the humbleness that comes with acknowledging that you are, I would say, like a child of the earth. I don't want to forget anything, but if you told me like this issue is something I care about, I would definitely say yes, and I care about that, and you too. But those are the three that pop into my head right away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and for sharing your authentic self. And again, inspiring all of us here today. I want to thank the participants, all of you who are watching and viewing at this time. I want to thank you all for being here, and to those who asked just amazing questions. I do want to remind those who signed up at 5 o'clock. We're going to have a small group discussion with Rosalie. So you should have received that link to join us with the sign up. And but for whatever reason, if you did not, I do have my email right next to my name. So you could email me now and I can make sure that you get that link to join us. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. And then Rosalie, if you can stay on, if the rest of you can stay on while the others leave, that'd be great. I just want to make sure you got your link. So thank you, everyone.